The city buzzed with life as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over towering skyscrapers and busy streets. Among the chaos of honking cars and hurried pedestrians stood Mr. Richard Langley, a man whose very name carried weight in the business world. He was the kind of person everyone admired, or envied from afar. With his sharp suits, commanding presence, and an empire built from sheer willpower, Richard seemed untouchable. But beneath the polished exterior lay a heart heavy with sorrow. Richard had climbed the ladder of success step by painstaking step, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and even moments meant for family. His wife had left him years ago, unable to bear the distance his work created between them. Now, all he had was Emily, his 10-year-old daughter, who had always been the light of his life. She was bright, curious, and full of laughter. Everything Richard wished he could be more of. Yet despite his love for her, he often found himself tied up in meetings or buried under piles of paperwork, missing school events, birthdays, and bedtime stories. But now, standing outside the gleaming doors of St. Mary's private hospital, none of those missed moments mattered anymore. All that mattered was Emily, lying motionless in a hospital bed upstairs. For weeks she had battled an illness no doctor could identify. Tests upon tests were run, specialists consulted, treatments attempted, but nothing worked. Her once vibrant energy had faded, leaving behind a pale, fragile version of herself. The doctors had whispered words like mysterious condition and unknown prognosis, but Richard heard only one thing. They didn't know how to save her. Every night, Richard sat by Emily's bedside, holding her hand and praying silently. Sometimes he would read aloud from her favorite books, hoping the sound of his voice might bring her back to him. Other times, he simply stared at her face, memorizing every detail, afraid it might be the last time he saw her smile. Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. If only he hadn't worked so much. If only he'd spent more time with her. If only... The what-ifs haunted him, each one heavier than the last. Outside the hospital, life went on. Street vendors called out to passers-by, offering snacks and trinkets. Cars zoomed past, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. And then there was Arun, a boy no older than 12, sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. His clothes were patched and worn, his feet bare against the cold pavement. A small tin cup rested beside him, half filled with coins tossed carelessly by strangers eager to move along. Arun wasn't like the other beggars who shouted for attention or tugged at sleeves. Instead, he observed quietly, his dark eyes taking in everything around him. For days, Aaron had watched the well-dressed man enter and exit the hospital. There was something different about this man, something deeper than the expensive watches or tailored suits. It was the way he walked, shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible burden. It was the sadness etched into his face, visible, even from a distance. Curiosity stirred within Arun. Who was this man? What weighed so heavily on his soul? One evening, when Richard stepped outside for a brief escape from the sterile hospital air, their paths finally crossed. Arun hesitated for a moment before approaching cautiously. Most people avoided eye contact with beggars, dismissing them as nuisances or worse. But Richard paused, perhaps because he sensed the boy's sincerity, or maybe because he needed someone, anyone, to talk to. "Sir," Aaron began softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of traffic. "Can I speak with you?" Richard looked down at the boy, surprised. He nodded, unsure of what to expect. Aaron swallowed nervously but continued, his words steady despite his trembling hands. "I've seen you coming here every day. You look sad. Is someone close to you sick?" The question caught Richard off guard. No one had dared ask him such a personal question in weeks, not even his closest friends or colleagues. Strangers kept their distance, unsure of what to say. Yet here was this boy, speaking with a clarity that felt almost unnatural. "Yes," Richard admitted after a pause. "My daughter. She's very ill." Aaron nodded slowly, as if he already knew. Then without hesitation he said, "Sir, I can heal your daughter. Richard blinked, certain he'd misheard. What did you say? I can help her, Aaron repeated, his voice firm this time. Just let me try. At first, Richard wanted to laugh. The idea of a street child claiming to possess healing powers sounded absurd, almost insulting. Was this some sort of trick? A ploy to earn money? But as he studied Arun's face, he saw no trace of mockery or deceit, only determination, and something else he couldn't quite place. Why should I believe you? Richard asked, his tone sharper than intended. Aaron didn't flinch. You don't have to believe me. But what do you have to lose? The doctors can't help her, right? Those words struck a nerve. Richard clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. How dare this boy point out the painful truth? And yet, wasn't it true? Every expert had failed. Every treatment had fallen short. If there was even the slightest chance, no matter how unlikely, shouldn't he take it? Before he could change his mind, Richard muttered, Fine. Come, with me. As they walked back toward the hospital entrance, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. This was madness. A beggar boy claiming magical abilities? Ridiculous. Still, deep down, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. Hope that had long been extinguished. Maybe, just maybe, miracles weren't confined to fairy tales after all. The hospital corridors were eerily quiet as Richard led Aaron through the automatic glass doors. The boy's bare feet padded softly against the polished floor, contrasting sharply with Richard's heavy, measured steps. Nurses and staff glanced, curiously, at the unlikely pair, a wealthy businessman in an impeccably tailored suit accompanied by a ragged street child. Whispers followed them, but Richard ignored the stares. His focus was singular. Emily. He didn't care what anyone thought, or said about bringing a beggar into the hospital. At this point, he was willing to try anything. Aaron, for his part, seemed unfazed by the attention. His wide eyes took in the sterile environment, the rows of rooms with their closed doors, the soft beeping of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Though he had never been inside a place like this before, there was no trace of fear in his expression. Instead, he walked calmly beside Richard, his small hands clasped loosely in front of him. When they reached Emily's room, Richard hesitated outside the door. For a moment, he questioned his decision. What if this was all a waste of time? What if Arun couldn't do anything after all? But then he reminded himself of the countless nights spent sitting helplessly by Emily's bedside, watching her grow weaker with each passing day. Desperation outweighed doubt, and he pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only sounds coming from the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the gentle hum of the oxygen machine. Emily lay still beneath crisp white sheets, her pale face framed by strands of golden hair. Tubes snaked from her arms to bags hanging on metal stands, delivering fluids and medications that had done little to improve her condition. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her breathing shallow but steady. Richard stepped closer to the bed, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. Emily, sweetheart, someone is here to see you. He wasn't sure why he said it, perhaps out of habit or because he needed to fill the silence. Either way, it felt important to acknowledge her presence, even if she couldn't respond. Aaron moved forward cautiously, his gaze fixed intently on Emily. There was something almost reverent about the way he approached her, as though he were stepping into sacred ground. Without asking permission, he pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down. For several moments, he simply stared at her, studying her face as if searching for answers written in invisible ink. Richard watched nervously from the corner of the room, unsure of what to expect. Was the boy going to touch her? Say something? Perform some kind of ritual? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making his palms sweat despite the cool temperature of the room. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, he blurted out, "What are you doing?" Aaron turned to look at him, his dark eyes calm and unwavering. "I'm listening," he replied simply. "Listening?" Richard echoed, confusion etched across his face. "To what?" "To her," Aaron said, nodding toward Emily. She's trying to tell me what's wrong. Richard blinked, taken aback. But she's unconscious, she can't speak. She doesn't need to, Aaron explained patiently. Sometimes words aren't necessary. You just have to listen with your heart. The statement sounded so absurd, so far-fetched, that Richard nearly laughed. Heartfelt platitudes weren't going to save his daughter. Yet, as he studied Aaron's expression, he realized the boy wasn't joking. There was a seriousness in his demeanor, a conviction that made Richard hesitate. Maybe it was exhaustion clouding his judgment, or maybe it was the desperation that comes when all other options have been exhausted. Whatever the reason, he decided to give the boy a chance. Fine, Richard said gruffly, crossing his arms over his chest. Do whatever it is you think you need to do. Arun nodded once more before turning his attention back to Emily. Slowly he extended his hands, hovering them just above her body without making contact. His fingers twitched slightly, as though feeling for something unseen. Then, closing his eyes, he began to whisper softly under his breath. The words were unfamiliar, melodic yet strange, flowing together like a song sung in a forgotten language. Richard leaned against the wall, watching intently. At first, nothing happened. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, and Emily remained motionless. Doubt crept back into Richard's mind. This was ridiculous. How could a child's whispered incantations possibly make a difference? He opened his mouth to say something to call off this charade, but stopped when he noticed a subtle change. Emily's breathing grew deeper, less labored. A faint flush of color returned to her cheeks, replacing the ghostly pallor that had haunted her features for weeks. The beeping of the heart monitor quickened slightly, signaling a stronger pulse. Richard froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was this real? Or was he imagining things, desperate to see improvement where none existed? Arun's whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though he were coaxing something hidden to the surface. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly, but he didn't stop. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours to Richard, who stood frozen in place, torn between disbelief and hope. Finally, Aaron lowered his hands and opened his eyes. He looked drained, his young face pale and drawn, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his expression. Turning to Richard, he said quietly, "She'll be okay now." Richard stared at him, speechless. His mind raced, struggling to process what he had just witnessed. It defied logic, contradicted everything he knew about science and medicine. And yet, the evidence was right in front of him. Emily's vitals had stabilized. Her breathing was easier. Even her skin seemed healthier, glowing faintly with life. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes, spilling over before he could stop them. He stumbled forward, sinking into the chair beside Emily's bed. Reaching out, he clasped her hand in his, marveling at the warmth returning to her fingers. How did you do this?" he choked out, his voice trembling. Aaron shrugged modestly, avoiding eye contact. "It's not me," he said. "I just helped her body remember how to heal itself." Richard shook his head, overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. "No one else could do what you've done, not the best doctors, not the most advanced treatments. You saved her." Aaron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and backed away from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. "Like I said, sir, I didn't do it alone. Healing isn't about power, it's about trust. Trust in yourself, trust in others, and trust in something bigger than us." As Richard absorbed these words, a wave of emotions washed over him. Relief, joy, guilt, awe. They swirled together, leaving him breathless. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that Emily might truly recover, that she might live to laugh again, to run through fields and chase butterflies like she used to. All because of this mysterious boy who had walked into his life out of nowhere. But questions lingered in Richard's mind. Who was Aaron? Where had he come from? And how had he learned to do something so extraordinary? As much as Richard wanted answers, he knew better than to press the boy now. Exhaustion radiated off Aaron in waves, and Richard suspected he had given everything he had to heal Emily. Whatever secrets Aaron held, they would have to wait until later. For now, Richard contented himself with watching his daughter breathe steadily, her chest rising and falling with newfound strength. The weight that had crushed him for weeks began to lift, replaced by a fragile but undeniable sense of hope. Whatever miracle had occurred in this room, it had changed everything, not just for Emily, but for him as well. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, casting warm golden beams across Emily's room. Richard hadn't left her side all night. He sat in the same chair where he'd collapsed after witnessing Aaron's inexplicable act of healing, his hand still firmly clasped around hers. Every now and then he would glance at the monitors, checking her vitals obsessively to confirm that what had happened wasn't a fleeting dream. But no matter how many times he looked, the numbers told the same story. Emily was improving. Despite the overwhelming relief washing over him, Richard couldn't shake the whirlwind of questions swirling in his mind. How could a boy who lived on the streets possess such an extraordinary gift? What kind of knowledge or power allowed him to heal someone when the world's best doctors had failed? And perhaps most importantly, why had Aaron chosen to help them? As dawn broke, Richard finally stepped out of the room to find Arun. The boy had disappeared shortly after performing his miracle, leaving Richard with little more than cryptic words about trust and faith. Now, as the weight of gratitude settled heavily on his shoulders, Richard felt an urgent need to understand the child who had saved his daughter's life. He found Aaron sitting quietly in the hospital cafeteria, sipping a cup of tea provided by one of the nurses. The stark contrast between the boy and the polished surroundings struck Richard once again. While everyone else moved briskly around him in scrubs or suits, Aaron looked like he belonged somewhere entirely different, a world far removed from sterile hallways and fluorescent lights. Yet there was a quiet dignity about him, an unspoken confidence that made people pause before dismissing him as just another street kid. Richard approached cautiously, pulling out a chair across from Arun. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard studied the boy's face, searching for answers in his calm brown eyes. Finally, he broke the silence. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Aaron shrugged, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "There's no need to thank me, sir. I only did what anyone should do when they see someone suffering." Richard shook his head, incredulous. "Anyone?" "No, not anyone. You're special. What you did, it's beyond anything I've ever seen. Please tell me how you learned to do it." Aaron hesitated, as if weighing whether to share his story. Then, with a deep breath, he began. "I come from a small village far away," he said softly. "It's not marked on any map, but it exists. My parents were farmers, simple people who worked hard to provide for our family. They didn't have much, but they had something even more valuable. Wisdom passed down through generations." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window as if recalling memories long buried. "In our village, we believed that healing wasn't just about medicine or science. It was about understanding the connection between body, mind, and spirit. Our elders taught us that every living thing carries energy, and sometimes when that energy gets blocked or disrupted, illness follows. By channeling positive energy and focusing intention, we can help restore balance." Richard listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. This explanation sounded foreign to him, almost fantastical. Growing up in a world dominated by facts and figures, he struggled to reconcile Arun's words with his own worldview. Still, he couldn't deny the results he'd witnessed firsthand. Whatever this energy was, it had clearly worked. "Did your parents teach you this?" Richard asked gently. Aaron nodded. "Yes, they started teaching me when I was very young. At first, I thought it was just stories, like fairy tales meant to entertain children. But then one day a neighbor fell ill. She had a fever that wouldn't break, and the nearest doctor was miles away. My mother asked me to try what she'd been teaching me, to focus on sending her good energy. I didn't think it would work, but it did. After that, I realized these teachings weren't just myths. They were real." His voice softened as he continued. But then, everything changed. A flood came during the monsoon season, destroying our village. My parents, they didn't survive. Pain flickered briefly in his eyes, but he quickly masked it. I ended up here alone, trying to survive however I could. I stopped using the skills my parents taught me because... He trailed off, looking down at his hands. Because I didn't want to forget them. If I used their gifts too often, it felt like I was losing a part of them. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes as he listened. The depth of Aaron's loss, and the strength it must have taken to endure it, was staggering. Here was a boy who had faced unimaginable hardship, yet still carried within him the ability to heal others. It was humbling, almost unbearable to comprehend. You haven't forgotten them, Richard said quietly. What you did for Emily proves that. Your parents' legacy lives on through you. Aaron smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in his expression. Maybe, but I didn't do it for recognition or reward. I did it because Emily needed help. Richard leaned forward, his tone earnest. I understand that, but let me help you. You've given me back my daughter. You've given me hope. Let me repay that kindness. I can give you money, education, a home, anything you want. To his surprise, Aaron shook his head firmly. No, sir. That's not why I helped Emily. I don't need those things. Besides, I've learned to survive without them. But you shouldn't have to, Richard insisted, his frustration mounting. You're just a child. Life on the streets isn't safe. Don't you deserve better? Aaron tilted his head thoughtfully, considering the question. Maybe I do. But safety doesn't always mean happiness. Out there, he gestured vaguely toward the city beyond the hospital walls. I'm free. I meet people, hear their stories, learn new things every day. It's hard, yes, but it's also beautiful in its own way. Richard sighed, realizing that arguing wouldn't change the boy's mind. Instead, he tried a different approach. If you won't accept help for yourself, then let me honor your parents. Let me build something in their memory. A school, perhaps, where other children can learn the values and traditions your parents passed down to you. For the first time since they'd met, Aaron's face lit up with genuine excitement. A school? He repeated, his voice tinged with wonder. That would make them proud. Then it settled, Richard declared, a sense of purpose igniting within him. We'll start planning immediately. You'll oversee the project, ensure it reflects the teachings of your village. And while we're at it, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Even if you refuse to live with me, I can provide resources to keep you safe. Though Aaron still seemed hesitant, he eventually agreed, recognizing the sincerity in Richard's offer. As they talked further, discussing details and possibilities, Richard felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just gratitude, it was inspiration. This boy had shown him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or possessions. It was found in acts of kindness and connections forged between strangers, in giving selflessly without expecting anything in return. By the time they parted ways later that afternoon, Richard knew two things with absolute certainty. Emily would recover fully, thanks to Aaron's intervention, and his own life would never be the same again. Over the next few weeks, Richard threw himself into planning the school project with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about honoring Aaron's parents or providing education to underprivileged children. It was about redemption. For so long, Richard had been consumed by his empire, chasing wealth and success at the expense of everything else. Now faced with the stark simplicity of Aaron's worldview, he realized how hollow those pursuits had been. This school would be more than bricks and mortar. It would symbolize a new chapter in his life, a chance to give back meaningfully. Aaron became an integral part of the process, sharing stories from his village and explaining the traditions that had shaped him. The boy spoke passionately about the importance of community, respect for nature, and the interconnectedness of all living things. His words painted vivid images of a world Richard had never known, one where people valued relationships over riches, where kindness mattered more than power. Listening to Aaron, Richard couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. How different his own life might have been if he'd grown up surrounded by such wisdom instead of ambition. Together, they visited potential sites for the school, touring abandoned buildings and empty plots of land on the outskirts of the city. Richard suggested modern designs with state-of-the-art facilities, but Aaron gently reminded him that simplicity was key. "Children don't need fancy classrooms to learn," he said. "They need space to think, to play, to dream. Sometimes less is better." Richard nodded, though it took some effort to let go of his instinct to build something grandiose. Slowly, however, he began to see things through Aaron's eyes. Instead of sleek glass walls, they opted for open-air structures with large windows that invited sunlight and fresh air. Gardens were added to the blueprint, not just for beauty but as spaces where students could connect with nature. A small library filled with books donated by local organizations rounded out the plan. By the time construction began, Richard felt proud of what they had created together. Not a monument to excess, but a sanctuary of learning and growth. During this time, Emily made remarkable progress. Her strength returned gradually, and soon, she was sitting up in bed asking questions about the world outside her hospital room. She marveled at the idea of a new school being built because of her, though she didn't fully grasp the depth of Aaron's role in her recovery. To her young mind, he was simply a kind boy who had come to visit and somehow made her feel better. Richard smiled whenever she mentioned him, grateful that his daughter's innocence remained intact despite everything she'd endured. As the days passed, Richard found himself visiting Arun often, bringing updates on the school's progress and checking in on the boy's well-being. Though Aaron continued to live on the streets, Richard ensured he had access to basic necessities, warm clothes, nutritious meals, and medical care when needed. He even offered to hire a tutor to teach Aaron reading and writing skills, knowing the boy's potential was limitless if given the right opportunities. Arun accepted these gestures graciously, though he maintained his independence, refusing to rely too heavily on Richard's generosity. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench near the construction site, Richard broached a topic that had been weighing on his mind. "Aaron," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking, you've taught me so much already, about healing, about gratitude, about seeing the world differently. But I can't help wondering, are you happy?" The question caught Aaron off guard. He tilted his head, considering it carefully before responding. "Happiness is complicated, sir. Some days, yes, I'm happy. Other days, I miss my parents and wish things were different. But happiness isn't the goal, is it? Life isn't always supposed to be easy or comfortable. Sometimes it's about finding meaning in the hard parts." Richard mulled over these words, struck by their profundity. Here was a child who had endured unimaginable loss yet still managed to find purpose in helping others. Meanwhile, Richard had spent decades accumulating wealth and accolades, only to realize how empty they felt without connection and compassion. The disparity between their perspectives humbled him deeply. "I envy you," Richard admitted after a long pause. "You've seen suffering, yet you haven't let it harden you. If anything, it's made you stronger, kinder. Me? I've spent my whole life running away from pain, burying myself in work to avoid facing it. And now when I look back, I see how much I've missed all the moments with Emily, with my family, with people who mattered most." Aaron placed a reassuring hand on Richard's shoulder. "It's never too late to change, sir. You're doing it already. Building this school, spending time with your daughter, those are steps toward healing, not just for others, but for yourself." Tears pricked at the corners of Richard's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." As twilight descended, casting a soft glow over the city skyline, the two sat in companionable silence. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they had formed an unlikely bond, one rooted in mutual respect and shared humanity. Richard knew he would never fully understand the depths of Aaron's abilities or the mysteries of the ancient teachings. He carried, but he didn't need to. What mattered was the impact Aaron had made, not just on Emily's life, but on his own. Later that night, as Richard tucked Emily into bed at home, she had finally been discharged from the hospital, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. His once cold mansion now felt warmer, livelier, thanks to Emily's laughter echoing through its halls. Pictures of her adorned the walls, alongside sketches of the school design and notes detailing its progress. Even the staff noticed a shift in Richard's demeanor. He was kinder, more patient, less consumed by the pressures of work. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to imagine a future beyond board meetings and profit margins. He pictured Emily growing up surrounded by love and support, attending the school they were building together. He envisioned Aaron standing proudly beside him at the inauguration ceremony, watching as children poured into classrooms eager to learn. Most importantly, he imagined himself as a better man, not perfect, but trying to be present, to listen, to care. Before drifting off to sleep, Richard whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for Aaron, for Emily, for the second chance he'd been given. Life had thrown him a curveball in the form of a beggar, boy with extraordinary gifts, and somehow it had led him back to what truly mattered. As he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. After all, miracles weren't confined to fairy tales. Sometimes they came in the form of a quiet voice saying, "Sir, I can heal your daughter." Months passed, and the school began to take shape. What had once been an empty plot of land on the outskirts of the city was now a bustling construction site, alive with activity. Workers hammered away at wooden frames, painters added vibrant colors to the walls, and gardeners planted rows of trees and flowers that would one day provide shade and beauty for the students. Richard visited the site regularly, often accompanied by Aaron, who seemed equally invested in the project's progress. Together, they walked through the unfinished classrooms, imagining how each space would be used, where children would gather, to read, where teachers would share stories, where laughter and learning would fill the air. Emily, now fully recovered, tagged along whenever she could. Her cheeks were rosy again, her eyes sparkling with curiosity as she explored the half-built structures. She loved hearing about the school's purpose and couldn't wait to meet the children who would soon call it home. "Can I come here every day?" she asked Richard during one visit, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I want to help teach them too." Richard chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "We'll see," he said, though secretly he adored her enthusiasm. It reminded him of Aaron, the same selflessness, the same desire to make a difference. Watching Emily interact with Aaron brought him immense joy. The bond between the two had grown stronger over time, built on mutual admiration and trust. To Emily, Aaron wasn't just the boy who had healed her. He was a friend, a mentor, someone she looked up to. As the school neared completion, Richard found himself reflecting on how much his life had transformed since meeting Aaron. He no longer spent endless hours buried in work or chasing meaningless deals. Instead, he prioritized spending time with Emily, cherishing moments he might have otherwise overlooked. They went on picnics, played games in the park, and read bedtime stories together. These small acts of connection filled him with a sense of fulfillment that no business achievement ever had. At the office, Richard implemented changes inspired by Aaron's teachings. He introduced initiatives to support underprivileged communities, funded scholarships for talented but financially struggling students, and encouraged his employees to volunteer their time for charitable causes. His colleagues noticed the shift. In his leadership style, he was more empathetic, more approachable, less focused on profit margins, and more attuned to the human element behind every decision. Some teased him good-naturedly, calling him the new Richard, but deep down they respected the transformation. Meanwhile, Aaron continued to live life on his own terms. Though Richard had offered him countless times to move into a comfortable apartment or attend formal schooling, Aaron politely declined. "This is my path," he explained one evening as they sat together under the stars. "I've learned so much from my village, from my parents, and even from living on the streets. I don't need fancy things to be happy." Richard nodded, understanding but still wishing he could do more for the boy. "If you ever change your mind," he said earnestly. You know I'm here. I know, Arun replied with a smile. And that means more to me than anything else. The day of the school's inauguration finally arrived, and the entire community turned out to celebrate. Parents, teachers, local leaders, and curious onlookers gathered around the freshly painted gates adorned with colorful banners bearing the school's name, Shanti Vidya Niketan, Sanctuary of Peaceful Learning. Children ran around excitedly, marveling at the playground equipment and peeking into classrooms filled with shiny new desks and books. Music played softly in the background, and the aroma of freshly cooked snacks wafted through the air. Richard stood at the podium, his heart swelling with pride as he addressed the crowd. Today marks not just the opening of a school, he began, his voice steady yet emotional, but the beginning of something greater, a commitment to nurturing young minds, fostering kindness, and honoring traditions that remind us of our shared humanity. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before continuing. None of this would have been possible without the courage and wisdom of a remarkable young boy who taught me what true strength looks like. Arun, please join me. A hush fell over the audience as Arun stepped forward, visibly nervous but smiling nonetheless. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing across the grounds as people cheered for the boy who had inspired it all. Richard placed a hand on Arun's shoulder, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, he whispered, loud enough for only Arun to hear. For everything. After the ceremony, Emily tugged on Arun's sleeve, pulling him toward the swings. Come play with me, she urged, giggling as she took off running. Arun laughed, following her lead, and soon the two were laughing and playing like old friends. Richard watched from a distance, struck by the purity of the moment. For the first time in years, he felt truly content, not because of what he owned or achieved, but because of the connections he had forged. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky to mark the occasion, Richard invited Aaron to stay at his home. Just for tonight, he insisted when Aaron hesitated. It's late, and you shouldn't walk back alone. Reluctantly, Aaron agreed, allowing Richard to lead him inside. The mansion, usually quiet and impersonal, felt warm and inviting, with Emily bouncing around, eager to show Aaron her favorite toys and books. Before bed, Richard sat with Aaron in the living room, sipping hot chocolate and reminiscing about the journey that had brought them together. Do you remember the first time we met? Richard asked, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. Aaron nodded, his expression thoughtful. You looked so tired, sir, like the weight of the world was on your shoulders. And you lifted it, Richard said softly. Not just by healing, Emily, but by reminding me of what really matters: family, kindness, purpose. Aaron smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the window where moonlight streamed in. You didn't need me to remind you of those things, sir. You already knew them, you just forgot for a while. Richard sighed, recognizing the truth in Aaron's words. Maybe, but thank you for helping me remember. Silence settled between them, comfortable and profound. Outside, the distant hum of crickets blended with the occasional burst of fireworks, creating a peaceful soundtrack to the night. Richard glanced at Arun, noting the calmness in his demeanor. Despite everything the boy had endured, losing his parents, surviving on the streets, he radiated resilience and hope. It was a quality Richard admired deeply, one he hoped to carry forward in his own life. Eventually, Aaron stood up, yawning slightly. I should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow? We'll be busy. Yes, it will, Richard agreed, standing to escort him to the guest room. As they reached the doorway, he placed a gentle hand on Aaron's shoulder. Good night, my friend, and thank you for being exactly who you are. Aaron's smile widened, genuine and heartfelt. Good night, sir. Sleep well. When Richard returned to the living room, Emily was curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached, and she murmured sleepily, Daddy, can Aaron stay forever? Richard chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He has his own path to follow, sweetheart, but he'll always be part of our lives. Emily nodded drowsily, snuggling deeper into her blanket. Richard kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment as he soaked in the sight of her peaceful face. This was happiness, not fleeting or superficial, but rooted in love, gratitude, and connection. As he turned off the lights and headed to his bedroom, Richard felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. Life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. It had been harder, messier, more unpredictable. But it had also been richer, fuller, and infinitely more meaningful. Thanks to a beggar boy with extraordinary gifts, he had rediscovered the essence of what it meant to live. Not just to exist, but to truly thrive. Months turned into years, and the school, Shanti Vidya Niketan, flourished beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a modest project became a beacon of hope for countless families in the community. Children poured into its classrooms, every morning their faces glowing with excitement. They came from all walks of life, some from nearby villages, others from the city's poorest neighborhoods. Yet within those walls they were equals, united by curiosity, determination, and the belief that education could change their futures. Richard visited often, taking pride in watching the students grow. He saw glimpses of Aaron in many of them, their resilience, their kindness, their hunger to learn. Teachers marveled at how quickly the children adapted to the unique blend of modern academics and traditional teachings Richard had incorporated into the curriculum. Lessons on science and math were paired with stories about nature, mindfulness, and the importance of giving back to the community. It was a holistic approach that nurtured not just minds, but hearts and spirits. Emily, now a teenager, became one of the school's most enthusiastic supporters. She spent weekends volunteering there, helping younger students with their homework or leading art workshops inspired by her own love for painting. Her bond with Aaron remained strong, though their interactions grew less frequent as time went on. Aaron still lived his simple life, moving between the streets and the outskirts of the city, content in his independence. Yet whenever he did visit the school, Emily would light up, eager to share her latest projects or ask for advice on navigating adolescence. One crisp winter morning, Richard arrived at the school to find Aaron sitting under a tree in the courtyard, surrounded by a group of wide-eyed children. The boy was telling them a story, a tale from his village about courage, sacrifice, and the power of unity. His voice carried a quiet authority, captivating even Richard, who stood unnoticed at the edge of the gathering. When the story ended, the children erupted into applause, begging for another. Aaron laughed, shaking his head. "Maybe next time," he said warmly. As the kids scattered to join their friends, Richard approached, smiling. "You're quite the storyteller," he remarked, sitting beside Arun on the grass. "They adore you." "They're amazing," Arun replied, his eyes following the children as they played. "So full of energy and dreams. It makes me hopeful for the future." Richard nodded, sharing the sentiment. Then, after a pause, he asked tentatively, "Do you ever think about staying here permanently? Teaching full-time, maybe? You'd be incredible at it." Aaron tilted his head thoughtfully, considering the offer. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but this isn't where I'm meant to be right now. My path is different." "I understand," Richard said, though a flicker of disappointment crossed his face. "Still, I wish you'd reconsider someday. You belong here, with us." Aaron smiled softly, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "I'll always be connected to this place, sir. No matter where I go, it will always feel like home." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, updates on Emily, plans for expanding the school, memories of the early days when the foundation was first laid. As they talked, Richard felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Aaron's presence, but for the ripple effect his actions had created. Because of one boy's selflessness, an entire community had been transformed. Lives had been saved, dreams ignited, futures rewritten. Later that afternoon, as Richard prepared to leave, he noticed Aaron walking toward the gates, ready to continue his journey. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt compelled to follow him. "Wait," he called out, jogging to catch up. "Before you go, can I ask you something?" Aaron turned, his expression curious. Of course, sir. Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, he blurted out, Why me? Why did you choose to help Emily when so many others are suffering too? For a long moment, Aaron didn't respond. He gazed past Richard, his eyes distant, as if recalling a memory hidden deep within. Then softly he said, Because I saw your pain. I saw how much you loved her, how lost you were without her. Sometimes, we don't choose who we help. It chooses us. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes, unbidden but impossible to hold back. I don't know how to repay you, he whispered hoarsely. No amount of money or praise feels enough. You already have, Aaron replied simply. By building this school, by being present for Emily, by becoming the person you are. Today, you've repaid me tenfold. Before Richard could respond, Aaron extended his hand, offering a firm yet gentle handshake. Take care, sir. And remember, the greatest gift you can give someone is your time, your attention, your heart. With that, Aaron stepped through the gates and disappeared into the bustling streets, leaving Richard standing alone. The encounter left him shaken, but also profoundly moved. Over the years, he had tried repeatedly to express his gratitude to Aaron, but words always seemed inadequate. How do you thank someone who has shown you the true meaning of humanity? Weeks passed, then months, and Arun's visits became fewer and farther between. Though Richard missed his presence, he understood that the boy's calling was greater than any single place or person. Still, reminders of Aaron lingered everywhere, in the laughter of the children, in the lessons taught at the school, in the values Richard now embodied daily. One evening, as Richard sat on the balcony of his home overlooking the city skyline, Emily joined him, clutching a sketch pad. Dad, look what I drew, she said proudly, holding up her artwork. It depicted a sprawling tree with branches stretching toward the heavens. Beneath it stood two figures, one tall and distinguished, the other small and unassuming, and surrounding them were dozens of smiling faces. It's beautiful, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. What does it mean? It's us, Emily explained. And Aaron. And everyone whose lives he touched. See how the tree grows bigger and stronger? That's because of him. He planted seeds of kindness, and now they're spreading everywhere. Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. You're absolutely right, sweetheart, he truly did. As they sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Once a man consumed by ambition and regret, he had emerged renewed, humbled, grateful and grounded in the things that mattered most. Aaron had been the catalyst for this transformation, a quiet force of nature who had reminded him of the beauty in simplicity and the power of compassion. Though Aaron himself had faded from view, his legacy endured. In the laughter of children, in the strength of communities coming together, in the warmth of connections forged across differences, he lived on. And Richard knew that wherever the boy wandered, he carried with him the same light that had illuminated their lives. That night, as Richard tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and murmured, Do you think we'll see Aaron again? Maybe, Richard replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But even if we don't, he'll always be with us, in our hearts, in the choices we make, in the way we treat others. Emily smiled, closing her eyes. Good night, Dad. Good night, my angel, Richard whispered, kissing her forehead, He turned off the light and walked to his study. Richard paused by the window, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, amidst the vastness of the universe, he felt certain that Arun was continuing his journey, touching lives, planting seeds, spreading hope. And in that moment, Richard realized something profound. Miracles weren't confined to grand gestures or supernatural events. They happened every day, in the smallest acts of kindness, in the moments when strangers reached out to lift each other up. With a deep breath, Richard closed the curtains and settled into his chair, opening a book he planned to read aloud during His next visit to the school. Life, he decided, was a series of beginnings and endings, intertwined like roots beneath the earth. And while he couldn't predict what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The lessons Aaron had taught him would guide him forever. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of gratitude, for trust, for healing, for second chances.